In today's class, we're going to discuss some more laws of preparing for Shabbos. As we know, one of the great, beautiful things of Shabbos is our food that we have for Shabbos, the enjoyable food that we eat. Today, we're going to discuss the laws of how one has to be careful today we're going to discuss where the food is allowed to be when Shabbos comes in. Once a person's cooking food before Shabbos, is the food allowed to remain in the spot where the food was being cooked before Shabbos? Could it remain on Shabbos in that same spot, or is it necessary to take it off the place where it was cooking before Shabbos? In the laws of cooking, I want to mention that what are the forbidden labors to do on Shabbos that are connected to cooking. So cooking itself, cooking with fire, is one of the forbidden labors on Shabbos. In cooking, it's not only turning on putting food on a fire to start the cooking process, but any part that is helping the food being cooked quicker is also forbidden to be done on Shabbos. And it's the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos. Besides the forbidden labor of cooking, there are times when there's food being cooked that there are other forbidden labors that could come about. It is forbidden on Shabbos to make a fire. So meaning cooking is forbidden even if there was a fire made before Shabbos. It's forbidden to cook food on fire. If you have a fire already existing before Shabbos, to go on Shabbos and place food on the fire would be forbidden because of cooking, even though you're not causing a fire to exist on Shabbos. So besides that it's forbidden to cook on Shabbos, it's also forbidden to make a fire on Shabbos. And similarly to cooking, just like by cooking, doing something that is not just the first start of cooking is forbidden, but other parts of cooking are forbidden. So too with a fire, if there's already a fire, but causing the fire to be larger is also forbidden because of the forbidden labor, because it's forbidden to make a fire. So largening a fire is included in the prohibition of making a fire. Another forbidden labor on Shabbos is extinguishing a fire. So if someone's cooking and they're going to cause a fire to be extinguished, that is also forbidden. And making the fire less is included in the prohibition of extinguishing a fire. We're holding inside in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, Chapter 72, Halacha 17. In this halacha, it's going to discuss when one was cooking food before Shabbos on coals. Not too common these days. We don't really cook food on coals. If you try it, your food's gonna it's not the greatest method of cooking. The food gets burnt. It's very difficult. I never tried it, but from what I hear, it's very difficult to cook properly when you cook on coals. Even when you cook on a grill that has coals, you're not placing the food or a pot on the coals. You're putting it on a rack. So that's not considered cooking on coals, which will be discussed in this halacha. Cooking on coals that's discussed in this halacha is that the food is actually placed on the coals. So let's see what the halacha is about cooking food on coals. Although it's not so common these days, we'll discuss after we learn the halacha inside some practical ways of cooking that that are more applicable these days. Hatafshilin tzrichen lahashkiach lasiran min hagecholim be'erev Shabbos. Cooked food that is being cooked on coals, it is necessary to remove it from the coals before Shabbos begins. Ve'im shachach v'lo yisirin. If a person forgot and didn't remove the pot from the coals, azay im yavay b'Shabbos lekachas hasekdera v'gecholim beires savivla. Then, if he would come on Shabbos to take the pot, and the pot is in a situation, it's in a situation that the coals are burning around the pot. Shemika hasektera yazes as like a es hagechalim, that if one would take the pot, it would cause the coals to move. In such a case, aser liyisrael lekachas isa. It will be forbidden for a Jew to take the pot. So we're not saying anytime you would leave the coals, you would leave the pot on the coals, automatically anytime during Shabbos, there would be coals burning around it. What we're saying is we don't allow you to leave the pot on the coals, because there could be a situation that the coals would be burning around the pot on Shabbos, and if one would take the pot, one would move the coals, which is forbidden which would be forbidden, because when the coals are being moved, it's causing some coals to burn more, which is the prohibition which is the forbidden labor of making a fire. And also it would cause some coals to burn less, which is the forbidden labor of extinguishing a fire. For a non-Jew to move the pot, it is permissible. Since that you're just telling the non-Jew to move the pot, and that the pot is causing some coals to burn more and some to burn less, is not what you're instructing the non-Jew. So therefore we say it's permissible. Still, you're not allowed to leave the pot on coals when Shabbos begins. We still say it's forbidden to do so, and you have to make sure to take it off before Shabbos. We're just saying that if it happened that a person forgot, then what they're allowed to do is they're allowed to tell a non-Jew to move the pot. Let's discuss now some other methods of cooking. A person is cooking on Friday on the stovetop. Are they allowed to keep the pot on the stovetop when Shabbos begins? So the answer is, it depends what state of where the pot is holding in the process of cooking. If the pot is already half cooked or more, then it's permissible. Then you're allowed to keep the pot on the stovetop when Shabbos begins. Just to point out, we're only talking now about what is to be done before Shabbos. They're allowed to keep something on. You don't have to remove it before Shabbos. The laws of if one's going to want to put it on Shabbos is going to be discussed later in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And so we'll talk about that later. And I wanted to point out that when we're learning these laws, that it's permissible, that in certain scenarios it's permissible to leave the food remaining on the element that you're cooking it with. This is the laws that we're learning for before Shabbos. If a person's going to want to put the food on Shabbos, it's going to have different laws. We'll have to wait till we learn that later in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. So so on the stovetop, if it's halfway cooked, if you have food that's placed on a stovetop and it's halfway cooked, it's allowed to remain there when Shabbos begins. Another method that a person could keep food on a stovetop is if they have they put a sheet of metal on the stovetop. And then on top of the sheet of metal, they place the pot. The sheet of metal is called a blech. The purpose of the blech is to remind a person that they're not allowed to change the temperature on Shabbos. The rabbi said that if you have this, you have something that's covering the place where you heat the food, then you're allowed to put the food on top of that covering. You're allowed to put the food on top of it. So like I said, you're allowed to put the food on top of the sheet of metal. And when you have a sheet of metal, it doesn't matter where the food is holding in the cooking process. Even if it's not halfway cooked, it's still permissible to put it on before Shabbos. So those are two methods of how one could keep food on a stovetop. Have food on a stovetop for when Shabbos comes in. Now, I just want to point out, it depends if there's an electric oven or a gas oven with regards to a sheet of metal. If you have a gas oven, a sheet of metal will always be good. If you have an electric oven, you have to be careful that the sheet of metal isn't red. If the fire is going to be on high, it could cause the sheet of metal to turn red. If the sheet of metal turns red, then we say that the sheet of metal is not functioning as a reminder. Now in Halacha 18, we're going to talk about having food in an oven. Is the one allowed to have food in the oven when Shabbos begins? Let's see inside Halacha 18. Hatavshilin shematminim betaner liyem haShabbos kenog. Food that is being warmed up in an oven for Shabbos day, to eat that food Shabbos day, as the custom is. Even though the door of the oven isn't sealed closed with clay, it's more a common practice for what they would do in those days. Not so common nowadays for people to seal their oven with clay. Mutter, it is still permissible, even though the oven is not sealed with clay. It is permissible to have food being warmed up in order to eat this food Shabbos day. V'asur leftayach hasataner b'layla kishema yesh k'deira shadayin loy nispashal kol tzarkan. And it's forbidden to open the door of the oven Friday night. The reason why it's forbidden is because maybe there's still pots that are in the oven that aren't yet fully cooked. So what's the problem if there are pots in the oven that aren't fully cooked? So it comes to tell us through closing the oven after you open it, it's going to cause the food to be cooked. As I mentioned earlier in my introduction to today's class, that causing the food to cook quicker is forbidden because of cooking. So when the oven is open, the oven isn't as hot because it has air coming from outside the oven. When one closes the oven, it's going to cause the oven to be hotter, which will cause the food to cook quicker, which is, as I said, that causing the food to cook quicker is forbidden. What if one wants to heat up food for Friday night? Could they have food in their oven? Could a person put food in the oven before Shabbos and let it remain in the oven on Shabbos with the oven on in order to have hot food for Friday night? So if the food is already cooked before Shabbos, the custom is to if the food is already fully cooked before Shabbos, and there's not going to be an issue of causing the oven to be hotter when one opens and when one closes the door afterwards, then it would be permissible. What's the case where it could be that the oven won't become hotter when you close the door afterwards? If an oven doesn't have a thermostat, then if the food was already fully cooked before Shabbos, it's not going to cause the food to get. It's not going to be an issue of making the food it's not going to be an issue of cooking the food since the food is already fully cooked, and the oven won't become hotter since it's already set for a certain temperature. Now, let me just make a little clear. It might have been a little not so clear. We need to be careful not just about cooking, but also that the oven doesn't become hotter. Change temperatures. So even if the food is fully cooked, we have to make sure that the oven doesn't change to higher temperature. So if when you open the door, the oven is cooler, and then when you close it, it's going to be hotter, there's going to be an issue. But there are ovens that you could get an oven. Some ovens come with a Shabbos mode, that they remain the same temperature, and they're not going to switch if the door opens or closes, the door of the oven. So in that scenario, it is permissible to keep food in the oven. You could keep the food in the oven Friday night if the food is fully cooked before Shabbos, and even if the oven is on. Now, if a person doesn't have a Shabbos mode, but they want to keep their food, keep it at least somewhat, keep it hot, try to keep it hot and not become cold, you're able to keep the food in the oven with the oven off. Some people do that they want to just have their food warm for Shabbos, and they turn off the oven before Shabbos, and then they're going to eat their Shabbos meal an hour or two later, and they'll keep the food in the oven, and the oven will keep it, will cause it that it won't will remain somewhat hot. Won't remain as hot, but it'll remain somewhat hot. Now let's go on to the next halacha, halacha 19. In halacha 19, we're going to see that it's not so black and white of keeping food in the oven. Even when the oven is not sealed with clay. We're going to say sometimes it's necessary to seal the oven with clay. Halacha 19. Ha demuter lahatmin gam kashe'ein ataner tuach betit. This that you're allowed to keep the food, to warm up the food, even when the oven isn't sealed with clay. This is specifically when you're keeping warm meat. That when you're warming up meat is something that takes a longer time to cook. Other foods take a shorter time to cook. And since that other foods take a shorter time to cook, when a person puts the food in the oven, it's going to be on their mind. Is the food almost ready? Let me see how the food looks. Is it getting cooked more? And because of that, the rabbis were concerned that one might want to be involved in the cooking and stir the food to cause it to cook quicker. Stir the coals or change the temperature. Do something. Turn the knob to change the temperature of the oven. So because of that, they said that we don't allow one to heat up food in the oven in a regular scenario if the food isn't cooked. And similarly, even if one is warming up legumes and dough, only that they are warming up the food a long time. They're putting the food in the oven a long time before sunset. What's considered a long time before sunset? It's considered it's considered a long time before sunset if it's in a manner that it's able to be cooked before sunset, partially cooked, to the extent that it's edible to be eaten in a time of need. If a person was really didn't want to wait for the food to be cooked properly, but as long as they're just waiting for it to be somewhat edible, then if the food is already at that state, when Shabbos by sunset, then you could even warm up in an oven, not just meat, but other foods. It just mentions legumes and dough, but it would apply to all other foods as well. You'll be able to heat them up, even though the oven is not, you're able to put them in the oven, even though the oven is not sealed with clay. However, if one is warming up legumes and dough, and as I mentioned, also all other types of food besides meat, right before sunset, near sunset, to the point that it's not going to be half cooked by sunset, it's necessary specifically to seal the oven closed with clay. So if the legumes or dough is not half cooked, we say the only way you could keep that food in the oven when Shabbos begins is if the oven is sealed with clay. That when you seal the oven with clay, it will prevent one from changing the temperature on Shabbos, touching the knobs. Since they'll see that the oven looks different, that it's sealed with clay, it will be a reminder that you can't, that today is Shabbos and I'm not allowed to change the temperature. And you need to be careful with this. You can't put legumes or dough in the oven if they're not yet halfway cooked and it's not sealed with clay. Because if a person wouldn't do so, they wouldn't make sure to put the food to have the legumes or dough half cooked or to have it sealed with clay. They wouldn't do so. then even if one did that, the food would be forbidden to be eaten, not only during Shabbos, but even after Shabbos, until the time that it takes to cook that food. So if the person was cooking legumes and it takes 2 hours to cook legumes, they would not be able to eat those legumes that they cooked until they wait 2 hours after Shabbos. The next halacha, halacha 20, is going to discuss if one sealed the oven with clay, who is allowed to take off the clay when one wants to take the food out of the oven? Once you seal the oven with clay, in order that you don't come to change the temperature of the oven. But then later on Shabbos, you want to eat the food that's in the oven. Who is allowed to take the clay off of the oven on Shabbos? B'Shabbos kishepoischen hataner shetuach batit. On Shabbos, when you open an oven that is sealed with clay, you should have the oven being opened. The oven should be opened by a non-Jew. If there isn't a non-Jew, it should be opened by a child. A child is, for a boy that is under bar mitzvah, under 13, and by a girl that is under bas mitzvah, a girl that is under 12. What if there's no child present? It is permissible even for an adult to open the oven. But when the adult opens the oven, they should open it in an unusual manner. So if it would be the regular manner to open the oven by using your hands, the palm of your hands, you shouldn't use your palm of your hands, but rather you should use the back of your hands, or use your elbows to take off the clay. Or another way that's not the usual manner. If you only use one finger, or you use less fingers, instead of using all your fingers, if you use a utensil to take off the clay, use the utensil differently or use a different utensil in order that it should be done in the unusual manner. An important idea that I didn't mention earlier in halacha 19 is that we said that meat takes a longer time to cook. What's the practical implication about this nowadays? So nowadays, our ovens work differently than the ovens in the days of the Shulchan Aruch, when the Code of Jewish Law was written. In earlier generations, way back many hundreds of years ago, I don't know when it changed, but definitely hundreds of years ago, the ovens weren't as efficient. It would take a longer time for food to cook. They didn't have as good of a fire. So to cook meat took many hours. It wouldn't just take 2-3 hours, let's say. It would take several hours, maybe 8 hours. I don't know exactly how long, but it would take much longer than it takes nowadays. So the idea that it says that you could cook, like you could leave meat in an oven, even if it's not partially cooked, you could leave meat in the oven when the meat is raw, would not be permissible nowadays. It's not permissible to put meat in an oven right before Shabbos, like it was in those days. Since nowadays, if you put meat in the oven, it could be ready a couple hours later, and there'll be the concern that you're going to still have your mind occupied about the meat that's in the oven, and there will be the concern that you might come to change the temperature of the meat in order to make sure that the meat is cooking good. However, in a slow cooker, in a crock pot, it takes much longer for things to cook. So for everything besides meat, even in a crock pot, in a crock pot, it's you would have to make sure that the food is partially cooked, and if it's not partially cooked, we would be concerned that you might come to change the temperature of the food that is in the crock pot. However, meat in a crock pot takes a long time to cook. So even if there's in the crock pot many things, not just meat, but there's also potatoes, it's a whole cholent, let's say. There's potatoes, there's beans, there's other things. Still, if there's meat, then we say if the food is raw when Shabbos comes in, if the meat is raw when Shabbos comes in, then it's permissible to have the food being cooked on Shabbos. It's permissible to keep the food in the, sorry, let me rephrase. It will be permissible to have the food the crock pot on. You would not have to take the food out of the crock pot, and you could leave the crock pot on when Shabbos begins. Now, this idea of keeping the food putting the meat in the crock pot right before Shabbos begins is a little difficult. You have to make sure that the meat is still raw when Shabbos begins. When Shabbos begins is sunset. You have to make sure that the meat will be raw by sunset. So my suggestion is to make sure, if you're cooking in a crock pot or wherever you're cooking, is to make sure that the food is halfway cooked when Shabbos comes in. If you're cooking, or you can make sure that the food, that there's a sheet of metal, a blech, that is under the food, under the pot. To put on the stove top, you could put a sheet of metal. So those are the suggestions, I'd say, the best ways to have hot food for Shabbos. To make sure that either it's halfway cooked before Shabbos, or to put a blech, a sheet of metal, under the food. Now, this is if you want to have, there's other ways you could have food hot that's not on the fire. You could just put it in the oven to keep it hot. But this is if you want to have it still having the heat of the fire, getting the heat of the fire, you should either make sure that it's halfway cooked before Shabbos, or that there is a blech under the food. That's the end of today's share, and I wish everyone a good Shabbos.